So, before we explore any bad or dirty code, let's dive right in. How do we name things correctly in our code? Well, let's differentiate between these three main blocks which I outlined, and let's have a look at the different rules. Variables and constants, and of course also properties and objects, which would be in the same category, are all data containers, you could say. We use them to store some data. That could be some data entered by a user, for example in a web application. That could be the result of validating that user input. It could be a list of products, a single product, anything like that. Here, for the names of these variables, constants, and properties, we typically want to use nouns or short phrases with adjectives which describe what's inside of the data container. For example, something like user data or just user. Something like is valid if we store a boolean. These would be good names, and we are going to see way more examples throughout this section. No worries. So that's how we want to name our variables and constants and properties. We want to describe what is being stored in them. Now, when it comes to functions and methods, the idea is a different one. Here, we don't store something in that function. I mean, there is code inside of it, but that code executes once a function is called, and therefore, in the end, functions and methods are, of course, commands which we can execute on demand, or we calculate values which we return. So they are commands or calculated values, you could say. For example, we could have a function which sends data to a server. We could have a function or method which validates some user input. And therefore, for function and method names, we typically go with verbs or again short phrases with adjectives. So here we could have something like send data as a name for the function which sends data to a server, or input is valid for the validation function. Maybe also just is valid. This would also be okay. So here we could have the same name as for the variable on the left, because we want to describe a value which is produced by the function here then. Though I will say that booleans are a special case here. If we had a function which produces a user object, for example, we might want to call that function getUser or createUser or something like that. But again, you will see more examples for these different scenarios throughout this section. Now, when it comes to naming classes, it's important to understand and keep in mind that we use classes in our code to create things, to create objects. For example, a user object or a product or an HTTP request body which we want to parse, something like this. And therefore, for naming classes, we also use nouns or short phrases with nouns, so simply multiple nouns combined with each other. Something like user or request body, which would be these multiple nouns being combined. That's how we want to use classes. And if you keep these basic rules in mind, you already got a good foundation for naming your code correctly, for naming the things in your code correctly. But of course, we're now also going to explore the different niche cases, variations, and then also how to pick the best noun for a given value being stored in a variable, for example. Because using a noun is just a start. Of course, you want to use the best noun, which best describes what's inside a variable or what's inside a function and so on. So that's, of course, what we're going to explore throughout this section.